In the shadowed hills of Kentucky, whispers tell of children born twisted by bloodlines too close, their cries echoing through cabins and hollers at night. The newspapers wrote of poverty, but the locals spoke of something far darker. Were these cries the sounds of suffering, or something unearthly no one dared to confront? Welcome to Hidden Docs, where America's darkest truths are unearthed. Tell us where you're watching from and subscribe so these forbidden stories keep reaching you. Tonight, we step deep into Kentucky's hills, where family secrets, poverty and superstition gave birth to legends still haunting the land. The hills of eastern Kentucky have always carried a silence that feels heavier than most. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, this silence was broken only by the crack of coal mines echoing in the distance, or the low whistle of a train pulling away from a dying town. As coal operations began to collapse, families were left stranded. Men who had worked their whole lives underground now had no way to provide. Mothers raised children in homes where the floors were dirt and where the closest store might be a 2-day walk. In this forced isolation, communities began to fold inward. Families married within families, not always out of choice, but because there were no outsiders left to turn to. Generations layered on top of each other until bloodlines began to knot and twist. The outside world barely knew these people existed, tucked away behind ridges, swallowed by forests that grew thick enough to block the sun. But in nearby towns, whispers spread. Travelers spoke of children with unsettling features, faces that didn't seem to fit, eyes too far apart or too close together. Some said it was simply poverty, the result of malnutrition, sickness, or harsh living. But others, in hushed tones, called it something darker, a curse passed down like a shadow that clung to each generation. Folklore began to creep into the narrative. In one story, it was said that a woman who had been shunned for witchcraft in the early 1800s placed a mark on the hills before she died, ensuring that no child born there would be normal. In another, old miners told tales of something buried beneath the mountains, an ancient presence that warped anyone who lingered too long near its domain. The lines between folklore and reality blurred, until the truth itself seemed distorted. By the turn of the 20th century, outsiders began to stumble across these hidden communities. Journalists, doctors, even missionaries, each left with stories that fueled the rumors further. They described children with pale, almost bluish skin, boys with underdeveloped limbs, girls with high-pitched cries that carried through the night. Some wrote their observations in medical journals, chalking it up to inbreeding and genetics. But others, especially locals who lived close by, refused to believe it was purely science. They swore the hills were haunted, that the cries of children weren't just the sound of deformities, they were echoes of something unholy. And yet the deeper you go into these ridges, the harder it becomes to separate fact from imagination. For the families trapped here, this wasn't mythology. It was daily life. A life where deformity became familiar, where outsiders rarely came, and where leaving was almost impossible. The hills of Kentucky kept their secrets buried. But one question lingered in the minds of anyone who heard the stories. Were these strange births simply the tragic result of isolation? Or were the children of the hills carrying something far more sinister, an old curse hidden in their very blood? The answer was something no one wanted to confront. If the hills themselves whispered of curses, the bloodlines told an even darker story. Across Appalachia, small pockets of families had grown so isolated that the outside world became little more than a rumor. Marriage was not a matter of choice, but of survival. And in these valleys where strangers rarely crossed the ridge, brothers became husbands, cousins became wives, and children bore the weight of bloodlines that were too close for comfort. One of the most infamous cases would surface in Troublesome Creek, Kentucky. In the late 19th century, locals began to speak of the Fugates, a family whose children were unlike any others. Their skin, shockingly, was blue, not the faint discoloration of a bruise, but a full, almost cobalt shade that made them appear ghost-like under the dim Appalachian sun. The scientific explanation came later. A rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, passed down through generations of intermarriage. But in those years, before doctors brought their lanterns and notes into the hollers, neighbors believed it was a sign of God's punishment, a mark of sin that could not be hidden. Medical reports from the 1920s described the Fugates with clinical detachment, cataloging symptoms as if writing about livestock. But to the people living near Troublesome Creek, these children were flesh and blood proof of what happens when families turn inward. Their blue skin became legend, and whispers spread that other hollers held even stranger sights. Children with twisted limbs, jaws that jutted unnaturally, cries that carried for miles. For families locked in these patterns, the line between survival and taboo blurred beyond recognition. To marry outside was nearly impossible. The nearest town might take 2 days on foot, and outsiders rarely accepted the dirt-poor mountaineers into their fold. And so the cycle repeated. Each birth carried the risk of revealing too much, of showing the deformities that outsiders would use as proof of monstrosity. And yet each birth also carried hope. Perhaps this child would be normal. Perhaps this one would escape the bloodlines' curse. But not every family was as willing to let outsiders peer into their lives as the Fugates. Some clans hid their children away, never allowing them to walk into the open. Neighbors claimed to hear wails in the night, thin voices crying from cabins whose doors never seemed to open. Rumors told of children locked in cellars, kept from sight not out of cruelty but from shame. The Fugates had given the world its medical curiosity. But elsewhere, far from the scribbled reports of doctors, darker stories were taking root. Families that did not want attention. Families that carried deformities too disturbing to be explained away with a rare condition. In the shadows of these forgotten valleys, bloodlines had woven together into something far more unsettling than blue skin. They had created clans bound not just by heritage, but by secrets. Secrets that no one dared to speak aloud. And soon, one of those families would draw attention for reasons far darker than any medical anomaly. Because behind their cabin doors, what they carried in their blood was only the beginning. By the early 20th century, the whispers in Kentucky's forgotten hills had grown into something darker than rumor. Families carried their secrets behind rotting wooden walls, and outsiders, when they dared to enter, claimed they heard sounds no wilderness could explain. It was always the children, thin voices drifting from cabins sealed tight, cries that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards. Some swore they heard them echoing in the woods at night, faint and desperate, as if the mountains themselves were mourning. These weren't the ghost stories told around fires to frighten children. These were testimonies whispered in fear from neighbors who swore they'd witnessed something real. In 1933, a local paper in eastern Kentucky carried a short article about strange cries reported near a homestead deep in Clay County. The article didn't name the family, perhaps out of caution, perhaps out of fear, but it hinted at unnatural arrangements among those living under one roof. Not long after, a traveling preacher wrote in his diary that he refused to enter one holler because the Lord's law has been broken there, and the children suffer for it. Court rumors from the 1940s tell an even bleaker story. Depositions hinted at incestuous unions, forced marriages between kin, and children born into households where shame was stronger than love. But trials rarely led anywhere. Witnesses recanted, families closed ranks, judges dismissed cases for lack of evidence, and through it all the children remained unseen, locked away, silenced by both fear and blood. Locals who lived through those years would later tell folklorists of cabins that seemed to breathe sorrow. One elderly woman, interviewed in the 1970s, remembered walking past a house as a girl and hearing little fists banging against the walls. Another man claimed he stumbled upon a child in the woods whose face seemed twisted, as if it bore the mark of too many generations folded inward. When he reported it to town authorities, no one believed him. "That's just stories," they told him. "You're chasing ghosts," and maybe they were. Maybe the cries belonged only to memory, to superstition, to a community haunted by the sins it refused to confront. But there's another possibility, one far more chilling, that the children were real, that their cries were muffled not by distance, but by the walls that confined them, that the ghosts haunting those hills weren't spirits at all, but flesh and blood victims of silence, because silence became the law of the mountains. Outsiders who tried to ask too many questions were met with hostility, sometimes even violence. "You mind your own," was the rule. And so the whispers grew. Each retelling added new details, but the core was always the same: children hidden in cabins, children crying in the night, children who never had a chance to be seen. Were they victims of abuse, born into families that chose secrecy over salvation? Or were they phantoms created by guilt, a guilty community, trying to bury its own complicity by imagining ghosts. The truth, like the cries themselves, was swallowed by the hills. But as the decades wore on, one family's story would break through the silence and drag the whispers out into the open, where they could no longer be denied. To understand the strange cries echoing through Kentucky's hills, we have to turn to one of the most unsettling families in Appalachian history, the Blue Fugates of Troublesome Creek. For nearly 2 centuries, the Fugates lived in near-total isolation in eastern Kentucky, descendants of a French immigrant named Martin Fugate, who settled there in the early 1800s. Through generations of intermarriage among cousins and kin, something rare and almost unthinkable emerged. Their children were born with skin tinted blue, not pale, not sickly, blue like veins come alive across their entire bodies. Doctors eventually discovered the cause: methemoglobinemia, a genetic condition made visible only through centuries of closed bloodlines. It wasn't a myth. The Fugates walked their rural roads in plain sight, their condition documented in medical journals as early as the 1960s. Their story was proof of what happened when blood ran too close to itself. But in the mountains, science was never enough. To neighbors, the Fugates were more than a medical curiosity. They were an omen. Children cried when they saw them. Some families swore the blue skin was a punishment from God, a mark left by generations who defied natural law. Others whispered that the cries heard in the woods, the ones neighbors swore rose from the cabins at night, were tied to the Fugates' lineage. That suffering followed their blood wherever it spread. The tales stretched beyond Troublesome Creek, drifting toward the Red River Gorge, a place already steeped in ghost stories. Locals claimed that on certain nights, if you walked the narrow trails near the sandstone cliffs, you could hear children sobbing in the distance. Some said the cries belonged to lost hikers. Others insisted they were echoes of long-buried children, products of incestuous unions who had died before their time. A hiker in 1942 wrote in his journal about hearing the wailing of a child, though not a soul was in sight. Decades later, in the 1970s, a folklorist from Berea College recorded an interview with a woman who remembered stumbling across a cabin near the gorge as a girl. She swore she heard a baby crying inside, but when she knocked, the door swung open to reveal only silence and a cradle rocking on its own. Were these stories just the folklore of a superstitious land, or were they memories buried in metaphor, the only way communities could cope with the reality of what happened behind closed doors? The connection between the Fugates' blue skin and the Red River cries may never be proven, but the timing is uncanny. As doctors began to write about the family in the mid-20th century, locals doubled down on the ghostly tales. The medical and the supernatural collided, and in that collision, folklore found new life. Some said the cries were biological, children weakened by rare disorders brought on by generations of intermarriage. Others swore they were supernatural, spirits of the unwanted and unseen, condemned to wander Kentucky's hollers forever. The truth, perhaps, is more horrifying than either. Because whether the cries came from disease, abuse, or memory, one fact remained: children suffered in silence, and the land itself carried their echoes. But as haunting as the Fugates' story was, theirs was not the only tale. Deeper in the Appalachians, there were families whose secrets were even more grotesque, where folklore was no longer enough to hide the crimes committed inside. If there was one force stronger than poverty and bloodlines in the Kentucky hills, it was faith. The churches scattered across Appalachia weren't just places of worship. They were lifelines, communities within communities, keepers of both salvation and secrets. In the coal towns and rural hollers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, preachers held power almost equal to lawmen. Their sermons warned of hellfire, of the dangers of sin. But when the sin happened inside families behind closed doors, those same pulpits often fell silent. Incest, abuse, and forced unions were not whispered from the lectern. They were covered in scripture, cloaked in a language of forgiveness and family purity. One documented case in Knott County, Kentucky, in the 1920s reveals how far this silence stretched. A young girl, barely 13, told neighbors that her father had been teaching her the ways of a wife. Instead of rallying behind her, the church elders gathered her family in a back room. The solution was not justice but repentance. The father was prayed over, The girl was told to obey and the congregation returned to their hymnals. The cycle continued. It wasn't just one case. Court archives from Breathitt County in the 1930s describe rumors of entire clans keeping their daughters at home, away from outsiders, until arrangements could be made inside the family. The law was distant, the roads poor, and the shame unbearable. Religion became a shield. Pastors preached about keeping the blood pure, twisting scripture to sanctify what was, in truth, generational entrapment. Outsiders were portrayed as corrupting influences. Family loyalty became sacred, and so the children's cries were swallowed not only by the mountains, but by the church walls themselves. Folklorists later wrote that in these communities, silence wasn't just a choice, it was survival. To speak against a father, an uncle, or a pastor was to risk exile, to be cast out of the only world you knew. For families who depended on one another to survive winters, to plant crops, to bury their dead, exile was worse than death. By the mid-20th century, even as modern medicine began to explain genetic disorders and reporters occasionally uncovered family scandals, local churches still acted as buffers. They offered meals to the hungry, but they also buried confessions beneath hymnals. A young woman in the 1950s told a Louisville journalist that she had begged her pastor for help. His response: "Your duty is to forgive, or the Lord will not forgive you." That same year, a body of a stillborn child was rumored to be buried in a shallow grave behind a cabin. The whispers reached the authorities, but by the time a sheriff rode into the hills, the evidence was gone, and no family admitted to knowing the truth. This was the terrible paradox of faith in the hills. Religion promised redemption, but in practice it demanded silence. It wrapped its arms around victims, only to bind them tighter. It kept families together, even as it tore them apart from the inside. And so the children's cries faded, not because they stopped, but because no one dared to hear them. The land grew heavier with secrets, and the echoes of silence proved deadlier than the screams themselves. But in the coming years, silence would no longer be enough. As roads improved and the outside world pressed in, the darkest secrets of the hills would begin to seep out, through rumors, newspapers, and trials that shocked the nation. For decades, whispers filled the hollows, but rarely reached the courthouse. Most crimes of incest, abuse, and child marriage dissolved into silence before the first hymn was sung on Sunday. Yet in rare moments, the walls cracked, and when they did, what spilled into the light was horrifying. In the early 20th century, county clerks in Clay, Breathitt, and not counties began quietly recording cases of illegal marriages. Court transcripts from 1923 in Clay County describe a girl of only 14 years, married by her father's approval to a man nearly 4 times her age. She had no say. Her words were not even recorded. The case ended with a fine for improper paperwork. Nothing more. By the 1930s, the pattern grew undeniable. Kentucky newspapers occasionally reported on incest scandals with sensational headlines, only to bury the details on the inside pages. The Lexington Herald in 1935 wrote of a family entanglement, where 2 sisters were found to have lived as common-law wives to the same man. The case drew gasps from the public, but the charges collapsed when witnesses refused to testify. The silence of kin was stronger than the voice of law. These scandals were never just about one family. They revealed a culture where secrecy was survival, and shame was more feared than crime. Judges often looked the other way, knowing that pressing too hard could mean uprooting entire clans, neighbors, jurors, even churchgoers. It was easier to dismiss, to file away, to forget, but sometimes the horrors could not be erased. In 1954, in Letcher County, prosecutors filed charges against a man accused of fathering children with his own daughters. The testimony, preserved in brittle court records, tells of girls barely in their teens, forced to share beds with men who were supposed to protect them. The sheriff who delivered the report wrote that the cries of the children could be heard through the thin boards of the cabin walls. Still, the sentences were light. The man received only a handful of years in prison, and upon his release, returned to the same hollow where his victims still lived. No protection was offered, no therapy, no escape. These fragments of justice, half delivered and half denied, left families broken but communities intact. The victims bore the scars in silence, while the perpetrators often walked free. And for every scandal that made it to court, there were dozens more that never left the cabin door. By the late 20th century, researchers and journalists began digging deeper. Sociologists from the University of Kentucky uncovered startling statistics. Child marriage was still occurring in rural counties, sometimes with the quiet blessing of local officials. In 1998, a series in the Louisville Courier-Journal exposed cases of girls as young as 13 legally married under parental consent. The past was not gone. It was repeating itself. But there was one case, one family whose story would not remain buried. When it finally broke into national headlines, it shattered the illusion that these scandals were just folklore. It proved that the cries in the Kentucky hills had always been real, and that the cost of silence had finally come due. By the early 2000s, the old stories resurfaced, not as folklore but as headlines. Local papers and national outlets sent reporters deep into the hills. They spoke with doctors, with social workers, and with the children who had once lived in silence. What they found was unsettling. Poverty had not loosened its grip. Isolation still drew tight circles around families, and in those circles, old patterns remained. Journalists described rooms with nailed-shut windows, children hidden away, and mothers who whispered of sins but dared not name them. Social workers confirmed what few wanted to believe, that cries in the night still echoed in some valleys, not as legend, but as the voices of the living. The mountains had changed, yet the silence had not. And with each report, a question grew louder. How many cries still go unheard? In the end, the cries of children in Kentucky's hills became more than history. They became legend. Some were the wails of the sick, hidden away in homes too poor for doctors. Some were the muffled sobs of victims silenced by bloodlines and fear. And some became something else. The people of the Appalachians whispered of ghost children, phantoms said to wander hollers and abandoned cabins, forever crying for help that never came. These stories were passed down as folklore, but they were rooted in something darker, truths too heavy to speak aloud. In Kentucky, myth and memory fused. Trauma became haunting. Silence gave birth to specters. And the hills themselves seemed to hold the weight of every secret never confessed. The legacy of those cries is not just supernatural, it is human. And it is haunted still. The ghostly hills of Kentucky remain half legend, half truth. Were the cries we hear in stories the voices of spirits, or the echoes of children that history failed to save? This is Hidden Docs. Subscribe and join us as we continue to unearth the secrets America tries to bury.